All right, good morning, everybody. This is Amanda Lee, the service hydrologist with the National Weather Service in Grand Forks. And I've got one of our lead forecasters here, Jim Kaiser, part of our hydro team here at the office, who will also be helping out with the webinar today. So we're going to dive right in, try not to make this too long, take up too much of your guys' time. So if I could move forward. There. So as bottom line up front, we got good news and bad news. The good news is there really hasn't been any kind of change since our last outlook back on January 23rd. That's regarding weather conditions, snowpack conditions, or river outlook information, since we really haven't had a whole lot of precipitation since that outlook. Snowfall since January 18th, which was our last big storm before yesterday technically, was actually running kind of below normal to maybe near normal in some spots. And we've continued to be somewhat mild other than a few chilly days like we've got now throughout the winter, so our frost depth continues to be shallower than normal. So on the other hand, the bad news is we also have little change since the January 23rd outlook. And what I mean by that is the fall was still wet, and the early winter was still wet. We still had record precipitation for them, and the soil moisture is still high due to that. And we are kind of looking at the February, March, April timeframe precipitation, maybe to track a little higher, be a little wetter as we head into spring, along with a little cooler. But we'll have to see if that pans out. So last outlook, we were kind of touting the possibility of a top 5 flood, and that was due to the precip conditions we had leading up until that point. But we are starting to run out of winter, thankfully. We still do have to worry about spring. So not completely off the table yet that this top 5 flood could still happen. So here is the new outlook categories and colors. You can see the major, moderate, and minor in the different colors for all of our river forecast points. And I think there was only one single point on this whole graphic that changed with this outlook, and that was for out in the Twin Valley area. So I think it went from major down to moderate. 50% chance. So other than that, the 50-50 chance of reaching major, moderate, or minor has stayed the same with this outlook issuance at all the rest of those forecast points. We've already seen a lot of this information, so I'm going to try to go through it kind of quickly, but just as a reminder, last fall and into November was a record wettest period for the state of North Dakota, and then that leads into the entire year of 2019 was a record wet year for a calendar year of 2019 for the entire state. Soil moisture obviously hasn't really changed much with our snowpack on the ground, so we're still up in that 99+ percentile across the entire northern plains and upper Midwest. Precipitation up through the 11th, so this is skipping over that the blizzard yesterday, which really wasn't much of a precipitation maker as it was wind and blizzard. There was a little bit of precipitation accumulated, but not a whole lot. But focusing on the period from September 1st until Tuesday through February 11th, the entire basin was running 4 to 8, maybe even a little higher than 8 inches above normal for that entire period. So that's nothing new. Everybody knew that. But the good news is that most of that fell before that January 23rd outlook. So since then has been fairly quiet. Looking at numbers specifically for Fargo and Grand Forks, you can see in the top table there, from September 1st through February 11th, Fargo's had 11.62 inches of liquid precipitation, and that brings them in at the 3rd wettest on record for that time period, which actually dropped them down to 3rd from 2nd. So we were ranking a little higher, but with our quiet conditions the last few weeks, Fargo area did drop down to 3rd place instead of 2nd. And you can see here, since our last outlook, they haven't even had 1/10 of an inch of precipitation since then. And that's not including yesterday's snowfall, but that was pretty minimal too. As for Grand Forks, on the bottom table, you can see we're still well above and soundly in 1st place there. And that was mainly due back to that September flash flood heavy rain event still. And since the January 23rd outlook, we've only had 0.06 of precipitation, not including a little bit more yesterday. So really very fortunate. That's been pretty quiet. We've shown this graphic before, but it's a nice reminder to look at. It'll show you The black bold line is showing you the stream flow for the Red River at Grand Forks throughout the years 2018 and 2019 from left to right on the graphic. And as it gets higher and higher and more into those blue shaded regions, you're getting more into that above normal. So you can see that September, October, November period last fall, that black bold line did peak above that blue part, showing that we were at record levels for that time of year at the Grand Forks gauge location. Moving forward, same for at Fargo, looking at the black bold line for last fall, you can see we weren't quite record, we weren't quite above those blue peaks, but pretty darn close. So we still were at the very, very high end of river levels ever seen for that time of year. And then we went into the freeze up at these levels. So like I mentioned, at freeze up, you can look at the black shaded area, the few stream flow observations we had back in December when we froze up, showing that we were much above normal or high, or probably even record for a lot of the locations in the Southern Valley. So real quick, everybody's seen these spring flood ingredients before. So first two, fall moisture, base stream flow, we already covered those. We had plenty of fall moisture, record levels, base stream flow, plenty of flow, record levels of that also. So then we head into the next three factors for the winter. Like I mentioned earlier, frost depths are still running below normal, only at about 8 to 30 inches, which is lower than we were last year. And that's thanks to the early snowpack cover that we did get earlier this winter. Winter snowpack we can still consider above normal for this time of year, thanks to the early activity we had. But thankfully, the last 3 weeks we haven't really added to it, so that's good news. The far northern basin remains the driest portion of the basin with the least snowpack. Snow water equivalent, or the amount of water that's sitting in the snow that's out there right now, is high. We're still sitting around those values that we normally would see at the end of the winter season as we head into spring, but we haven't really added to them the last few weeks, so that's the good news. So real quick, going through frost depth, generally 10 to 30 inches across the northern 2/3 of the basin. In the south, a little less, but still kind of around normal, even lower than normal. So we are a little shallower, not frozen as deep as we were, especially last spring. Snow depth, this is as of yesterday, kind of a general range of 10 to 20 inches across the heart of the basin, and then the far southern basin and over into the Devil's Lake Basin has less, maybe 6 to 12, 6 to 15, 6 to 16, kind of in those ranges. So it is a little high for this time of year since we still do have some winter to go, but we haven't been adding to it. Same thing with the snow water equivalent in that snowpack, kind of 3 to 5 inches up and down the valley, lesser in the south and the north, and then over towards the Devil's Lake Basin. So kind of that Oslo to Grand Forks down through Fargo, and then either side of the red are definitely the hardest areas where they have more water content in their snow. A quick comparison graphic, there's kind of a lot of words on here. February 2011, so at this time, back in 2011, we did have 1 to 3 more inches of water in the current snowpack in the southern and central valley. So that's good news that 2011 was still a bit higher than we're sitting right now. And as a side note down at the bottom, February 97 also had higher snow water content, while February 2009 actually had less. So it kind of depends also, as everybody knows, how the spring is going to play out. So the amount of liquid water in the snow isn't the end-all be-all for what kind of flood we're going to see. It's just one of the indicators. So what's next? The last two ingredients, how is the spring thaw cycle going to go, and are we going to see any spring rains? So obviously that's yet to be determined, but they're going to end up being pretty big factors as we head down the stretch here. So what's upcoming weather-wise? Here's for the next week, precipitation. So through next Wednesday, pretty much not a whole lot expected. A few weak minor systems quickly passing through might bring a little bit of some light snowfall, but generally less than 1/10 of liquid precip expected. Moving into the week after that, so we're kind of looking at that February 20th to 26th time frame. maybe we'll move into some above normal temperatures, get out of this freezing cold that we're in right now, and be a little quieter precipitation-wise. And then after that, for the rest of the end of February, maybe a little more active at the end of the period. Kind of hard to tell at this point. This outlook was issued a few weeks ago already, so we'll have to remains to be seen what will happen through towards the end of February. And lastly, the February, March, and April outlook, so getting us through the bulk of our melt. The same outlook that was issued on January 16th hasn't been updated quite yet. Continues to show below normal temperatures and above normal precipitation. So if that were to come true, that would lead us to our delayed melt with the potential for quicker runoff, a faster melt with maybe some rain on top of it. But this should be updated here in the next few days, so we'll see how that changes. So real quick, here's our graphic again showing moderate to major flooding pretty much across a good extent of the valley, but not a whole lot different from what we put out with our last outlook. I'm just going to run through a few quick hits of the highest forecast locations at this point. So the Wild Rice River area, we are expecting to see quite a bit of runoff down there. Pretty good chances for being above major no matter what happens from here on out. Maybe even towards that high end. So, and here's our additional PFAS, or probabilistic flood outlook summary graphic, kind of showing that same data, just in a more easily digestible format. So you can see there the 95th percentile and all the way up to the 5th percentile are well above the major flood line. So pretty much a guarantee down at Abercrombie. For Fargo, the same thing. These numbers actually changed very little. The biggest difference at Fargo was kind of that 95 to 98, 99 percentile did bump up a little bit, while the higher end up here at your 1-2% did go down a little bit. So they did start to narrow that range a little bit for the Fargo area, which we'll see more and more as we get closer to the spring. But it's still going to depend on how the rest of the spring plays out. But pretty solidly into the major flood category with the current conditions that we have out there right now for Fargo. Same thing shown here, 95% and downward is all above major flood category. Sheyenne might be one of the more active regions to pay attention to as we head into the spring here, which will be kind of a change from what they saw last spring, although in the fall they were pretty active too. So this is going to be an area to keep an eye on. Pretty good chances of exceeding major flood category there as we stand right now. So that'll be an area to watch. However, you can tell more easily on this graphic how large their spread is. So, 90% chance of getting pretty close to minor flood stage, and then things ramp up a little bit from there. But still a lot of spread. A lot is going to depend on what happens as we head through the rest of the winter and into the spring here for up and down the Sheyenne. For Grand Forks, kind of the same thing as Fargo. That upper end went up a little bit, or the lower end went up a little bit, while the upper end went down a little bit, kind of closing that gap. But still pretty good chances of major flood stage there. If we get lucky, maybe we'll stay a little lower down in moderate, but we'll see. Same story here. A lot of numbers clumped together there above major flood category. But pretty much sure bet that will at least get into moderate. Oslo, nothing new there. Plenty of breakouts, pretty much guaranteed no matter what happens with the weather conditions from here on out. Above major flood category, likely access to town will be shut off. The same old story there. You can see here, couldn't even fit a lot of numbers on here because they're so close together. Pretty much a guarantee above major flood stage. Grafton, once we get further north into the valley, kind of above the Grafton, Oslo, and the rest of the valley up to the north, a lot drier up there with chances not nearly as bad as down south for decent flooding. Do note that these numbers for Grafton do not take into account the bypass that has been built, so the river gauge will not actually display what kind of values we're going to see here, but for areas outside of the diversion or outside of the city that aren't protected, can still use these for planning purposes and compare to past years on how they could prepare for these kinds of levels. So, like I said, pretty low chances here. Maybe action, maybe into minor flood stage, and if things really get crazy through the end of the winter and into the spring, we could maybe reach up into the moderate and major levels. I think the last one I picked out here to show was for Pembina. So same thing at Oslo here. All up and down the red will be pretty high river levels, pretty good chances of major flood stage. So pretty much a guarantee to get into that major category up at Pembina. And that's also shown here. Last but not least, here's the latest for over in the Devil's Lake Basin. So currently they're sitting at about 1449 feet, which is about a foot higher than they were at last year at this time, thanks to the wet spring, or wet fall, excuse me. They are looking at good chances in that 25 to 75% range of a 2 to 3 foot rise. So they haven't seen these levels for several years. So that wet fall really pushed them up into a higher category than they normally could have been. So lastly, the same thing. The good news is that we haven't had a whole lot of change in the last few weeks. So most numbers from the January 23rd outlook remain pretty close to remaining valid. I haven't had a whole lot of precipitation or snowfall, pretty mild for the most part, so our frost depth continues to be pretty shallow, especially compared to last spring. But the bad news is that the stuff that already happened and fell, precipitation that fell earlier in the winter and fall, is still there. So we're still tracking that snowfall that's already on the ground and the wet soils that we had from last spring. So climate outlooks continue to favor cooler and wetter this spring. We'll see how that pans out and if any updates kind of start changing that around. We're still looking at the potential for a top 5 flood, but it will still depend on what happens the rest of the winter and the spring. So if we continue this quiet period, that would be great. We'll have to see what happens as we continue on here. So here we are in closing, moderate to major up and down the valley, on the tributaries for the most part too. Lesser chances on the tributaries in the far northern valley for any kind of moderate to major flooding, a little drier up there. So will we still be higher than spring 2019? We'll see how the winter and spring play out and see how that works out. So we'll have 2 more scheduled outlooks, Thursday, February 27th and Thursday, March 12th. So 2 weeks from now and then 2 weeks again from there will be the next 2 outlooks. And we'll follow the same procedures there doing that. If you ever have any questions, shoot Jim or Greg or I an email here, or feel free to contact the office at the email address there or the phone number 24/7. Someone will always be here to answer the phone, answer any questions you might have.